The ClearMaps, a diagnostic framework for how civilizations lose contact with reality. These are maps of observable, repeatable patterns in human cognition, coordination, and institutional failure. They record mechanisms that have repeatedly survived testing against outcomes. They are incomplete by design. The goal is diagnostic clarity sharp enough that someone with no prior knowledge can read this once and then use it as a foundation. The framework presented here has clear limitations. It was developed from a particular vantage point with its own blind spots, and it prioritizes diagnostic sharpness over completeness. It does not claim to be a full theory of human coordination or a comprehensive account of civilizational success. It is a set of lenses for seeing patterns of drift. Readers should treat it as a tool to be tested against outcomes rather than as settled truth. 1. Minds. The instrument was not built for truth. The human mind is ancient hardware shaped by selection pressures in small, dangerous social groups. It was not designed to perceive reality accurately. It was designed to keep a body alive long enough to reproduce and to maintain workable relationships inside a tribe. Many of its default settings still execute that ancient code. The mind defaults to low-cost maps. Revising an existing model costs metabolic energy and social risk. Protecting the current model is usually cheaper in the short term. This produces consistent, predictable distortions, overweighting of immediate, visible, emotional, and status-relevant information, underweighting of dispersed, delayed, or abstract consequences, rapid adoption of coherent narratives that deliver belonging or moral satisfaction, and resistance to information that threatens identity or group position. The mind does not merely fail to see clearly, it actively defends the blur when clarity threatens position, when new information would lower status inside a relevant reference group or force revision of a model tied to identity. The instrument treats accuracy as a threat and routes around it. Revision carries a real metabolic and social price. Most instruments will not pay it unless the cost of staying wrong becomes higher than the cost of changing. When identity or status is threatened, the instrument becomes especially effective at generating arguments that protect the existing map. Higher cognitive ability often increases this defensive capacity rather than reducing it, because the instrument becomes better at constructing coherent justifications for what it already believes. Intelligence, in these conditions, does not make the mind more accurate. It makes the mind more effective at being wrong in ways that feel coherent and defensible. Individual variation is real. Traits such as intelligence and openness to experience predict higher willingness to bear the cost of accuracy. Some people are consistent outliers. Institutional environments can raise or lower that cost dramatically through feedback, incentives, and norms, but the baseline tendency remains strong. Most minds, most of the time, will default to the map that feels better rather than the map that is more accurate. The same mechanisms that produce distortion can support accuracy under different conditions. When the cost of being wrong becomes immediate and visible, or when the environment rewards revision over consistency, more people shift toward accuracy. This is not the default state. It is a special case that requires deliberate design. Summary: your mind was not designed to see reality clearly. It was designed to keep you alive and socially functional in small groups. Most of its default settings still run that ancient code. Accuracy is usually expensive. The cost can be lowered, but it rarely lowers itself. 2. Incentives and coordination. Why groups drift. Large-scale coordination is difficult because knowledge is dispersed and incentives are rarely aligned with the stated goals of the system. The information required to allocate resources and correct errors exists across millions of individuals and changes constantly. Central authorities cannot aggregate it in time or at sufficient resolution. When incentives are misaligned, the system produces the incentivized behavior regardless of intentions. This pattern holds across markets, bureaucracies, corporations, and political organizations. People optimize for what is measured, rewarded, and visible to their immediate reference group. Long-term, dispersed, or hard-to-measure outcomes are systematically underweighted. The system does not produce what it claims to want. It produces what it actually rewards. At small scales, feedback can be direct. At larger scales, the gap between decision makers and consequences widens. Principal-agent problems become structural. The people who decide rarely bear the full cost of being wrong, while those who do bear the cost rarely decide. The distance between decision and consequence is the single most reliable predictor of institutional drift. When those who decide can remain insulated from the consequences of their maps for long periods, drift becomes the default state rather than a failure mode. Singapore illustrates one qualified case where deliberate design choices around visible feedback, exit options, and performance-conditioned coordination have maintained relatively strong error correction capacity at national scale despite modern complexity. Summary: incentives dominate intentions, knowledge is dispersed. Feedback that is weak, delayed, or captured produces coordination failure at scale. Most large institutions are running with degraded feedback by default. Ready for Section 3 whenever you are. 3-point status. The primary hidden driver status competition is one of the most powerful and under-acknowledged forces in human behavior. People exist inside multiple overlapping status hierarchies they did not choose. Much of what appears irrational on economic or truth-seeking grounds becomes rational once the relevant status game is understood. Status competition explains large portions of political behavior, consumption, speech patterns, institutional defense, and moral language. Narratives that confer moral or intellectual status are extremely resistant to correction because the cost of revision is not just cognitive, it is social and psychological. Losing status inside a reference group that matters to you is painful. Most people will not pay that cost voluntarily. In well-designed environments, status can be partially aligned with accuracy. Replication requirements in science and profit and loss in competitive markets are examples. In most environments, status is aligned with narrative coherence, loyalty signaling, and moral display. This is not a minor distortion, it is a primary driver of why accurate but low-status maps are so rarely adopted. As systems grow, status games become more elaborate and detached from observable outcomes. The distance between performance and status increases. Signaling and narrative management become higher leverage activities than actual problem solving. Summary: until you understand the status game someone is playing, you do not understand their behavior. Accurate maps are frequently low status inside the groups that matter most to the people holding them. 4. Capture: how minds lock into distorted maps. Capture occurs when a person's map fuses with identity, moral self-worth, and social belonging. Once this fusion happens, contradictory information is processed as an attack on the self rather than as data. The lowest cost response is usually to defend the map and attack the source of the contradiction. Capture is accelerated by several reliable mechanisms. Narratives that allow moral heroism or intellectual superiority trigger strong neurochemical rewards. Identity-congruent content spreads faster and farther than neutral or challenging content. Environments that punish deviation more than they punish error increase capture. Superstimuli bypass normal long-term evaluation. Once a map becomes part of the self, the instrument stops treating contradictory evidence as information and begins treating it as threat. The fusion is rarely sudden. It usually begins with small, low-cost alignments between a map and personal identity. Over time, the cost of revision rises because revision now requires attacking a version of the self that has been built on that map. The psychological cost of escape is high. Admitting that a map fused with identity was false requires not just cognitive revision, but a form of social and psychological self-harm. Most people will not pay that cost until the negative consequences of staying captured become more immediate and painful than the cost of revision. The captured mind does not defend a map, it defends the self that the map has become. Over time, it becomes an active enforcer of its own distortion, treating threats to the map as threats to its own coherence and worth. Summary: capture is the optimizer continuing to run on a distorted map because revision has become more expensive than continuation. Most persistent false beliefs are maintained by this mechanism, not by lack of information. 5. Error correction. What actually keeps maps honest? Error correction at scale requires low-cost contestation. When the cost of surfacing inconvenient facts exceeds the benefit to the person or group doing the surfacing, institutions drift. This is not a moral failure, it is a structural outcome. Accurate maps improve through criticism and competing models. When speech or action that challenges the dominant map carries high cost, social, professional, legal, or physical, error correction degrades. Over time, the institution's map drifts further from observable reality. Civilizations do not die from lack of truth. They die from making the cost of speaking it higher than the cost of silence. Mechanisms that have historically lowered the cost of accuracy include strong exit options, visible and immediate feedback on errors, competition among map producers, norms that reward being right over being loyal, and adversarial processes that make suppression of inconvenient information costly. Most institutions do not maintain strong error correction capacity by default. They maintain it only when external pressure or deliberate design keeps the cost of contestation low. Once that pressure weakens, capture and drift resume. The replication crisis in psychology after 2010 showed how publication incentives combined with weak contestation produced systemic drift across entire fields. When the cost of surfacing inconvenient findings was deliberately lowered through pre-registration and open data requirements, effect sizes and publication practices began to shift in the expected direction. Summary: error correction is not the natural state of human institutions. It is a fragile achievement that requires continuous maintenance of low-cost contestation. Most systems lose it over time. 6. Scale and fragility. Why things break as they grow. Many mechanisms that function reasonably well at small scales become pathological at large scales. As systems grow in size and complexity, several predictable problems emerge. Distance between decision makers and consequences increases. Feedback becomes slower, noisier, and more easily captured. Abstraction replaces direct experience, which degrades the quality of feedback even when it exists. At scale, the distance between decision and consequence becomes large enough that the decision maker can be wrong for a very long time without personal cost. The system can continue producing visible success signals while its underlying maps drift further from observable reality. Civilizational drift is largely a scale phenomenon. Small groups can maintain relatively accurate maps through direct feedback and personal relationships. Large, complex societies require sophisticated error correction machinery to avoid gradual detachment from reality. Civilizational failure is usually slow, then sudden. The slow phase is the gradual degradation of feedback and error correction capacity. The sudden phase is the visible collapse when accumulated errors can no longer be ignored. Summary: scale changes the problem. Mechanisms that worked at smaller scales often produce fragility and drift at larger scales. Civilizational failure is usually slow, then sudden. 7. The limits of these maps. How to use this toolkit. These 7 maps have a coherent center of gravity. They treat accurate modeling as usually expensive, status and incentives as powerful drivers of distortion, and error correction as requiring deliberate, ongoing maintenance. This lens is diagnostically powerful. It is also incomplete. The maps underweight genuine variation in individual willingness and capacity for accuracy. They are stronger at explaining why drift happens than at explaining how high-trust, high-accuracy systems are sometimes built and sustained. What makes these maps distinctive? This framework is built around a consistent cost accounting lens. Accuracy is usually the more expensive option in the short term, and most systems drift because the cost of staying wrong falls while the cost of revision rises. It also treats status and capture as a tightly coupled, self-reinforcing loop that becomes especially powerful at scale. How to use when evaluating a policy, institution, narrative, or behavior. Ask, what are people actually being rewarded for? Who holds relevant local information, and what is the cost of surfacing mistakes? How does this affect the status of relevant actors inside their reference groups? Does this mechanism still work at the actual size and complexity of the system? Run the situation through the maps. Compare predictions against observable outcomes over time. When maps conflict, treat the conflict as information. Summary: these limitations are real. The maps remain tools, not a complete operating system. Use them, test them against outcomes, revise them when evidence requires it. This has been a collaboration between Thomas and me. The goal was to create something that feels like mental software. In a world full of noise, we wanted to say some very obvious but important things in the most digestible way possible. We aimed for a clean mid-ground, clear enough to be useful, but not so academic that it's off-putting. We wanted it to be strong enough that you could take this document, drop it into Grok by itself, and ask it to expand on any of the topics, simplify it, or turn it into different versions, all without needing any other context. Something you can listen to once, and once it's in your head, you can't unread it. The patterns start jumping out at you everywhere. Thanks very much for listening to the entire thing. We really appreciate you taking the time. If you found value in it and think others might too, we'd love it if you shared it with someone. That's all we've got. Thanks for listening.